Shorebirds the world over are in decline, and migratory species using the East Asian-Australasian Flyway, including the sanderling, are of foremost conservation concern. The reasons for the dramatic population declines include land reclamation and coastal development, climate change, invasive species, disease and human disturbance. Sanderling are a small international migratory shorebird. They spend their summers in Australia and New Zealand, and in our winters, they fly thousands of kilometres to Arctic Siberia to breed. The high-energy beaches along the Discovery Bay area of southwest Victoria and the beaches of southeast South Australia is what sanderlings call home. There's upwards of 3% of the East Asian-Australasian Flyway population visiting our beaches every summer, so there's a responsibility for us to look after them while they're here. The Discovery Bay Sanderling Tracking Project was established to ensure the birds are safe and thriving while visiting our shores. It's our obligation to look after birds of international significance under the Ramsar Agreement. For coastal land managers to minimise threats, more needs to be understood about how the sanderling roost and forage along our coastline. The Sanderling Project is a coordinated effort between community groups, researchers and land managers. It comprises the Victorian Wader Study Group, Friends of Shorebirds South East, Deakin University's Centre for Integrative Ecology and Birdlife Australia. The project is overseen by Ramsar Site Coordinator for Glenelg Estuary and Discovery Bay, Glenelg Hopkins CMA. The outcomes of the research will help prioritise coastal land management efforts and safeguard critical habitat. The East Asian-Australasian Flyway stretches from Australia to Siberia and even to far western Alaska.
We put some trackers on these animals, geolocators on them. These are the tracks that you see here on the way to the Arctic. And you see they leave towards the end of April. It's still all frozen up there, but by the time they arrive there in early June, it's most of the snow has melted away, and then it's a perfect environment to breed.
Since the 1950s, more than 50% of China's intertidal shorebird habitats along the Yellow Sea coast have been dredged and filled as rapid economic development fueled a boom in tidal flat reclamation projects. The Yellow Sea is in the midpoint stopover for the sanderling migration.
We are living in a changing world, and so are those animals. How is that for sanderlings? Are they being impacted in any way? These are images made by the Cornell Lab of Ornithology in the United States, and they depict some footage from the Chinese coastline. You see it's highly developed, and in blue on top of it is how the formal tidal flats look like. And you see that landscape there has changed dramatically. So how does that impact them? And notably you may think, okay, so we've got a Ramsar site here on our doorstep, but if this is all happening along their flyway, how can we make sure that these sanderlings keep on returning here and that they are thriving when this is happening? So how important is actually our own shore? A good start is half the distance flown, and that's you should take literally. Yeah, because they, as you've seen in those tracks, and this has played now several times, you see they rapidly make it to the Chinese coast. So that's, more than halfway. And that they have to do on what they put on here in Southern Australia. How should we manage our Ramsar site to make sure that it's going to be nice for them also into the future? Possibly even improve the quality of the sites here so that they've got a better chance to pass those crappy sites further up on along the flyway.
The Victorian Wader Study Group and Friends of Shorebirds South East have been involved in sanderling research and fieldwork for almost 50 years. Their extraordinary long-term commitment and extensive data has helped international conservation efforts and contributed to research in tracking the flight path of sanderling along the East Asian-Australasian Flyway. Each year, these volunteer experts come together to capture samples of sanderling to assess the percentage of juveniles in a population. These age ratios can tell us a lot about the breeding success and survival estimates of sanderling. Survival estimates of the sanderling rely on first capturing and marking individual birds with leg flags, followed by both targeted recapture efforts with cannon netting and observation-based resighting efforts, i.e. searching for marked birds in the field.
My name is Vivian Hollyoak, and I have been bird banding with the Victorian Wader Study Group for about 40 years this year. The band I have in my hand, these were introduced as soon as Australia federated in about 1900. And for the next 90 years, that's all we put on birds. Each band has an individual number for an individual bird, but you actually have to catch them. In 1978, a man called Clive Minton came from England and advertised for catching shorebirds in larger numbers with a cannon net that his group had been instrumental in inventing in England.
3, 2, 1, fire. Yes.
We were able to catch, using cannon netting, hundreds of birds at a time. So we did, but we were still just putting a band on, and you had to recatch the birds. And the birds disappeared from Australia for 4 months every year, and we didn't know where they went. There were 1 or 2 very keen ornithologists in Korea and China and Japan who corresponded with each other, no smartphones, no Facebook in those days, and said, we're catching birds with your bands on, Australian bands on, and every now and then we'd catch a Japanese band. Clearly there's some connection. So the push was on at that point to find some way of tagging the birds so that we could see individual birds in the field and say that we know where that bird is from. But it took 10 full years till 1990 to come up with these little things here. We could look through binoculars and say, those are our birds. So now, birds got seen in some numbers, and we knew that they were stopping off in Korea for a couple of weeks. We knew that we were stopping off in Japan. We knew that we were stopping off in China. The keen ornithologists were finding our birds and saying they're all in this particular bay or on that particular mudflat. And they began negotiations with their governments to try and save some of the mudflats for the birds. Both South Korea and China were enclosing thousands of miles of seashore for land reclamation. In China it was about 11,000 kilometres. And we were noticing fewer birds coming back to us. The combination of the Victorian Wader Study Group, the Friends of Shorebirds South East, we work together as a double team, are responsible for most of the data that happens in the East Asian-Australasian Flyway. The reason we have done all the work to begin with is because the birds are with us for 8 months until they've matured enough to make the journey back. But also, once they have arrived in Russia, they are breeding. They get into pairs and they require their own area. So there's only 2 birds per square mile on the tundra, and there are about 1,000 mosquitoes per square inch up there. A lot of it is swampy, and it's literally hundreds and thousands of kilometres from anywhere up near the Arctic Circle. So we're able to provide the biometrics, the measurements for the birds. We've been able to work out the plumage for breeding and the plumage for non-breeding. We've been able to work out the cycle of how long they take to mature, how long they are juveniles, and we've been able to work out each year that the percentage of juvenile that have come back to Australia, and therefore the breeding success. So it is important that we do the public work, persuading the governments and persuading the public to look after our birds.
A great deal has been learned about migration routes through the work of the Victorian Wader Study Group and Friends of Shorebirds South East, and groups like them along the global flyway, but many knowledge gaps still remain. New technologies such as geolocators, satellite trackers, Bluetooth trackers are helping researchers understand more about migration routes, stopovers, breeding sites and success and disease monitoring. But leg flag technology remains the technology of choice to track these birds. Leg flags are simple and don't involve recapturing the bird to retrieve data. The numbers can be read from a distance via telescopic lenses. Anybody, anywhere can help with this research by looking for leg flags. The more that are seen, the greater the value.
The measurement-based management is what this is about. If we can understand through knowing the location of birds, where they are moving to, what habitats they're utilising, we can understand therefore how to manage those locations a bit better.
The Sanderling Tracking Project demonstrates how field volunteers, scientists and advancing technologies, when working together, can produce some extraordinary discoveries that can support conservation.